That story is still to come this hour, but first let's go back to our top story now, the violence in Syria and the calls for UN sanctions from Washington. I can now cross live to James Denselow. He's a writer on Middle East politics and security, joining us live there in London. James, good to see you here on RT. Now, Syria has become a new focus in the Middle East, and the US is monitoring the situation very closely. Do you think, though, that Washington's calls for sanctions could lead to another no-fly zone resolution, as we've seen there in Libya?
Well, I think we've got a long way to go before we see any form of direct military intervention in Syria. The situation clearly is not ripe for that. What's interesting now is whether Syria, a country that has withstood various degrees of US sanctions over the past decades, will actually be deterred by any further sanctions imposed on it by the international community. I think we have to particularly look at the role of Europe in this case. Europe is responsible for about 20% of Syria's economy, essentially for 20% of Syria's trade. So I think the Europeans can come up collectively with a message where previously in Libya they failed, then I think we have a very interesting case of whether Syria finds another incentive not to crack down heavily against its own people.
You say the situation isn't ripe there, but doesn't the West have a humanitarian obligation when we are seeing reports of civilians being targeted by the authorities? People are dying there. I know we're not getting a clear picture from journalists there, but we're certainly getting pictures from Syrians there themselves. So isn't there an obligation for the West to intervene? One rule for Libya? Surely there's the same rule for Syria.
Well, I think that we can only be so far when we go down this line of perspective in terms of comparing the various different scenarios across the Middle East and North Africa. Certainly, the British Prime Minister would say that a certain number of factors have to be met. You have to have international legitimacy through the UN Security Council, you have to have regional backing, and you have to have the capacity to know that your actions will make things better. Now, on all three fronts in Syria, these things are far from clear and far from certain. So I think that it's not simple enough to say, OK, we have the responsibility to protect something that's gone through the UN and was approved in the General Assembly in 2006, yet is yet to be sort of fully codified by the major powers. And instead we have more of an ad hoc coming together of alliances at a deep time of global financial crisis. And people will be very conscious of the fact that Syria is not Libya, and the fact that if you do decide to intervene in Syria, you will have knock-on effects across the region, in Iraq, in Lebanon, to Israel-Palestine, in a scenario that the Western powers feel very dubious about finding themselves sort of neck deep in.
Well, as you know, we talked to many analysts on RT, and looking at a wider agenda here. Some are saying this isn't just people power, what we see in Libya and what we see in Syria. There's a hidden agenda from Western influence. And indeed, I was talking to a former Reagan administration official. He told me a little earlier that the US has got its eyes on Syria because it would actually like to undermine Russia's influence in the region. As we know, Moscow and Damascus have been very close allies for decades, and Russia has a large naval base in Syria. Do you see any element of truth in that theory?
Well, not at the moment. I think that the Americans will be very conscious of the fact that any pressure they put on Syria today will simply force Syria towards more traditional allies such as Iran and, as you mentioned, Russia, a country who has been able to take advantage of the fact that the Europeans and the Americans have largely shunned Syria over the past 10 years, and that has allowed them an opportunity to forge cultural, economic and political links. So I don't think the Americans have that on their mind. I think they're far more concerned with shoring up their traditional interests in the region. And Syria always has a sort of Janus face on this. It represents both sides of the coin. At one point, people thought that the US Army would turn left at Baghdad and invade Damascus. That is now a sort of a scenario that is almost totally forgotten. And instead, we're looking at a far more realist policy coming from Washington, looking at potentially engaging Syria. But that was before these Arab revolts across the region. And it now seems that the real scenario here is not about Washington or London or even Moscow. It's far more about what the Syrian people and the Syrian military choose to do today, because that is the current conflict line that the country is characterised by.
Could you talk more about this alliance that Syria has with the likes of Iran, Hezbollah and also Hamas? Many people saying that that alliance could be weakened if the regime is toppled. But at the same time, what sort of threat does that pose to Israel? How does Israel come out in all of this?
Well, I mean, the regime has been there for decades. So the point is, if it's toppled and if something, if a vacuum occurs in its place, then all bets are off. And we don't know what will happen in Syria in terms of its regional allies, whether the proxies of Hamas and Hezbollah that it supports, or whether its very traditional ally in Iran. Iran, I think, will be a sort of marker for Syria, a close ally who has put down a popular rebellion of its own in the previous 2 years, and therefore will have some experience and recommendations of how to do that.
Yeah, but
now,
could Iran be drawn into this and be provoked if something, if Syria does become unstable, and indeed if there is foreign intervention there in Syria?
Well, those are two very different things, and I certainly think that if there is foreign intervention in Syria, yes, Iran's intervention in response to that is a definite and very real possibility, just as much as it interfered in Iraq when the US invaded that country. However, if Syria's domestic uprising is simply that, and one where there isn't clear and obvious foreign intervention on top of it, then I think the Iranians would find it very hard for their own legitimacy in Syria, an Arab country, as well as the capacity to do it, of putting down someone else's rebellion. So I think those are two very different scenarios.
Well, very interesting to hear what you have to say. Thanks very much for giving us your point of view and explaining how you see the situation there developing. James Denselow, as always, good to have you here on RT. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.